Hey everybody, this is chapter 12 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein, translated by Adam Baltner. Chapter 12 is titled Point of Indifference. Quote, or might it even concern something like the central equal to heating of the whole? Arno Schmidt. Zitara und der Weg dorten. Section 1. A gap. According to Marx, labor or labor power is the only, quote, total exclusion of objective wealth, end quote. Marx. In Hegelian terms, it is the negation of capital, the, quote, real non-capital, end quote, and thus the, quote, only use value which can present an opposite and a complement to money as capital, end quote. Marx. As a commodity, labor power gains use value as a consequence of being consumed to create value. Quote, the opposite of capital is the independent, firmly self-sufficient objectified labor is living labor capacity itself, and so the only exchange of means of which the only exchange by means of which money can become capital is the exchange between the possessor of capital and the possessor of living labor capacity, i.e. the worker, end quote. Marx. Labor capacity or labor power has use value insofar as labor capacity is a condition for the possibility of labor. Footnote. Marx uses the terms, quote, labor power, Arbeitskraft, and, quote, labor capacity, Arbeitsvermögen, synonymously. Quote, we mean by labor power or labor capacity the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in the physical form, the living personality of a human being, capabilities which he sets in motion whenever he produces a use value of any kind, end quote. Marx, end footnote. Labor capacity or labor power has use value insofar as it is a condition for the possibility of labor. From this it follows that actually performed labor, labor which produces commodities and hence value, is the realization of labor power's use value. A physiological as physiological potential, human labor power is simultaneously both nature and value. Quote, this value is equal to the labor time required to produce the means of subsistence necessary for the reproduction of labor capacity, or to the price of the means of subsistence necessary for the existence of the worker as a worker, end quote. Marx. Footnote. This is an ambiguous definition of the amount of value of the commodity of labor power, a fact which Michael Heinrich has criticized as a failure of Marx. Quote, what Marx can be accused of is not sufficiently emphasizing the particularity, the definition of labor power's value. ... For the analysis of a particular capitalist society, a narrow definition of the value of labor power, the level of reproduction and the mode of reproduction is naturally of decisive importance, end quote. Heinrich. End footnote. End footnote. When the capitalist purchases the commodity of labor power, the capitalist also acquires the right to use that labor power, and productively employing labor power, he creates value with it. Indeed, he uses labor power to create more value than what it cost him, which is to say he has labor power perform more labor than is necessary to produce the commodities he will need to reproduce his labor power. By all means, equivalents are exchanged throughout this process. The total value of the commodity of labor power is remunerated in accordance with the society-wide average. Footnote. Quote, This seems a paradox and contrary to everyday observation. It is also a paradox that the Earth moves around the Sun and that water consists of two highly inflammable gases. Scientific truth is always paradox, if judged by everyday experience, which catches only the delusive appearance of things. End quote. End footnote. Marx. The accruing surplus value does not arise from circulation, for example, from unfair exchange, but rather from production. It is a product of wage labor. Quote, this discovery, end quote, Walter Tuchscherer argues, quote, is one of the greatest in the field of political economy, end quote. For, quote, it forms the key with which Marx goes on to solve all the contradictions in which economists prior to him had gotten entangled, as long as it was assumed that the capitalist paid the, quote, value of labor, end quote, bracket, and not the value of labor capacity, end bracket, why the, quote, value of labor, end quote, the wage, does not equal the value produced by the labor, why a particular quantity of objective labor is exchanged, had to remain an insoluble contradiction, end quote. This discovery allows the existence of surplus value, and therefore also the self-movement of capital, to be explained not in spite of, but on the basis of the exchange of equivalents. Quote, labor power, Adorno claims, quote, is the source of surplus value because it is the same as it because labor power is at the same time use value and exchange value, end quote. Adorno, and therefore a commodity, because workers as subjects are both part of society and nature, or more precisely because society and nature are actually one with each other. Labor is not limited to producing commodities. As it produces commodities, it can also produce surplus value. As part of what is usually designated as, quote, first nature, end quote, labor power expresses labor power itself as labor existing both under and for capital, while capital in turn exists and for, quote, second nature, end quote. Footnote. Oh, never mind, no footnote. Quote, the capitalist epoch is therefore characterized by the fact that labor power, in the eyes of the worker himself, takes on the form of a commodity which is his property. His labor consequently takes on the form of wage labor. On the other hand, it is only from this moment that the commodity form of the products of labor becomes universal, end quote. Marx. By capital becoming the, quote, totality of commodities. The totality of commodities, end quote. Marx. Here Adorno largely follows Marxian theory, quote, the illusion in the process of exchange lies in the concept of surplus value, end quote. Adorno. A concept which is based on the appropriation of surplus value by the purchasers of labor power in compliance with the exchange of equivalents. Adorno suggests that also at the point of indifference between nature and society, as well as between classes, everything is in keeping with like for like. Both classes appear equal from the perspective of exchange, and nothing in their formal equality suggests that the class relation first constitutes itself in the exchange of labor power for wages. Quote, in order to understand the concept of surplus value, two time spans have to be compared: the time which is necessary for the production of labor power and the time that the worker gives in labor. One must not start with the commodity produced by the worker, but rather it is a matter of an exchange process. The worker sells his labor time for which he receives his equivalent, but the time he gives and the time that is needed for the reproduction of his labor power are different, end quote. Adorno. The equality in this exchange manifests itself in the fact that the capitalist can say to the worker, quote, please, you're expending such and such amount of labor power. I'm going to give you just enough to reproduce this labor power, end quote. Meanwhile, the inequality lies on the one hand in the difference between the, quote, reproduction costs of the average social labor power expended by the worker, end quote, and on the other in the, quote, labor power calculated in the labor hours, which the worker spends in the apparatus of production, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. The concepts of the worker and the capitalist, whereby the worker sells his labor power to the capitalist for wages, should, quote, not be seen, say, as descriptions of individual processes, but rather from the perspective of society as a whole, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the result of this disparity, which is constitutive for surplus value, is that the worker's labor does not belong to the worker, that the worker cannot have at his disposal the products of his labor. His products are foreign to him, which means that there must be someone else, someone more powerful who is stealing them from him. End quote. Adorno. Domination is no longer immediate, something exerted by some human being over others. Rather, it is social, or in a manner of speaking, structural. Domination over, quote, first nature, end quote, which is exerted by human beings seeking to free themselves from being dominated by nature, results in human beings dominated by, quote, second nature instead. Additionally, Adorno sees a, quote, increasing anonymization of domination being, quote, enacted in the capitalist system, end quote. Quote, with the increase in capital's concentration and the enormous increase in importance of the administrative apparatus, the power relations on the side of capital increasingly recede into the background. That is why it is difficult to identify those who actually have capital at their disposal. Nevertheless, there is a dominant group, although they do not compose a class when viewed quantitatively. Parenthesis, if the concept of class demands a certain quantity, end parenthesis. However, keeping in mind that Marx defines the concept of class according to the position of human beings in the production process, it can be said that there are absolutely still classes today, even though leveling tendencies are becoming manifest in subjective consciousness, end quote. Adorno. For Adorno, precisely in the exchange of labor power for wages, quote, the dialectical power of Marxian thought can be more adequately perceived, than in the frequently invoked oppositions between factors relating to being and factors relating to consciousness, between forces and relations of production. After all, for Marx, exchange in bourgeois society exhibits a strict dialectical character insofar as it both is and isn't the exchange of equivalents, as can be demonstrated by the substitution relationship between wage and labor. Specifically because a commodity's value is determined by labor time, which is socially necessary for its production, yet the production of the commodity of labor consists of its social reproduction. The commodity is paid for according to the commodity's value, even when the worker only recovers the cost of its reproduction while handing over its full use value. The objects of exchange, the amount of labor expended by the worker, and the means of his reproduction is paid out in money, or in other words, according to the measure of labor value, equal. Yet on the other hand, because labor is the only commodity, which not only has value, but also creates value, they are also unequal insofar as the average expenditure of labor time, which the worker needs to produce as means of reproduction, is smaller than what he in fact sells to the entrepreneur. One second. End quote. In this passage from a transcript taken in his seminar from the 1955 to 56 winter semester, Adorno still conflates the terms labor and, quote, labor time, just as Lukács does in History of Class Consciousness. Later, however, he adheres much more closely to Marxian terminology when he claims that, quote, labor disaggregates into two parts, wages which are necessary for the reproduction of labor power and in surplus labor. Marx would measure this difference according to the average socially necessary labor time. The average labor time spent by the worker at the site of production is greater than the labor time necessary for the worker's preservation, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the surplus value of the entrepreneur, end quote, Adorno claims, quote, emerges where a gap is revealed in equivalent exchange, and indeed where what the worker gets for his own commodity, labor power, which also reproduces itself, is less than what he gives, end quote. Adorno. Here, where, quote, exchange is by no means pure circulation anymore, end quote, but instead, quote, immediately relates to production, end quote. Exchange under capitalist conditions of production is revealed to be both just and unjust at the same time. Quote, Adorno sought the origin of the real difference between concrete and abstract, the particular and the general, ultimately in the process of production as well. ... Therefore, for Adorno, exchange is ultimately an exchange between wage labor and capital, which is realized in production as a unity of real differences. The concrete process of labor and the abstract process of valorization. As the exchange of wages for labor power, exchange encroaches on production, thereby becoming totalized throughout society. Although Adorno and Horkheimer are often blindly declared to be, quote, founding fathers of circulation Marxism, end quote, Hans Loser und Reiter. Adorno is actually acutely aware of the site at which exchange, as society's constitutive principle, involves production, namely that the site at which precisely, quote, because everything fits, something doesn't fit, end quote, at which, quote, the principle of equivalence, ... is violated by being upheld, end quote. Footnote. Hans Loser and Reiter continue as follows, quote, particularly with Adorno, it is less the case that he interprets the Marxian definitions as socioeconomic categories, and far more the case he plumbs the depths of their epistemological and epistemo-critical potential, end quote. Hans Loser and Reiter. Almost aside from the phrase regarding plumbing the depths of potential, in its vagueness, this statement may or may not pertain to some of Adorno's text. It certainly does not pertain to Adorno's social critique, as it misses the indissoluble connection between the critique of socioeconomy and of knowledge in Adorno's work. End footnote. Ingo Elba has taken issue specifically with this statement. Quote, Marx's point of explaining the emergence of profit on the basis of exchange of equivalence is not based on setting up a statement and showing how it is contradicted by the process of exchange. Rather, it shows that the real conditions of freedom and equality in exchange are interactively bound up with conditions of heteronomy and exploitation on another level. That of the immediate process of production as a process of consumption of labor power. By this, Marx criticizes both the projection of the conditions of exchange onto the entire process of capital's reproduction and the misconception that these conditions are a mere structural element of capital. Thus, Adorno's engagement with the dialectical character of Marx's critical account of economy remains crude, end quote. Ingo Elba. However, in the passage where Adorno makes this statement, he is engaging neither with the dialectical character of Marx's critical account of economy, nor with exchange as a structural element of economy. His point, rather, is that, quote, the concept of the exchange society, ... should be seen as an eminently critical concept, end quote. Exchange, in whose concept, quote, the principle of equivalence is co-posited, end quote, can systematically correspond neither to the concept of equivalence nor therefore to its own. The exchange of equivalence is not actually an exchange of equivalence, but rather a, quote, ideological illusion, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. However, this illusion does not become immediately visible to the worker in the sale of labor power, but rather only later once he has to finance his life with the wages received. Quote, the merchant presents, the workers, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno write in Elements of Anti-Semitism, quote, with the promissory note they have signed on behalf of the manufacturer. The merchant is the bailiff for the whole system, taking upon himself the odium due to others. That the circulation sphere is responsible for exploitation is a socially necessary illusion, end quote. Dialectic of Enlightenment. And footnote. Yet indeed, it is also more than this. Section 2. The truth of the expansion. Quote, in an exchange, something is the same and simultaneously not the same. It is, and at the same time, is not above board, end quote. The discovery of this principle by Marx confirms for Adorno that Marx, quote, takes dialectic seriously, and does not simply coquette, and with dialectics terminology, end quote. Adorno. The dialectical upshot, which Adorno sees recognized by Marx, is that the, quote, assertion of the equivalence of what is exchanged, the basis of all exchange, end quote, is, quote, repudiated, end quote, precisely, quote, by its consequences, end quote. Adorno. Although Marx may have, quote, left behind no class theory, end quote, Adorno maintains that, quote, the theory of surplus value implies a class theory. If one views the appropriation of alien labor, as the core of the formation of class, as does Marx, this means that the position of human beings in the process of production determines their fate, for only those who control the means of production can appropriate surplus value. According to Marx, the precondition of the realizability of surplus value are class relations, end quote. Adorno. Adorno regards the Marxian theory of surplus value as the, quote, actual conceptual model of Marxism, end quote. Footnote. Adorno refers to the theory of surplus value as the, quote, centerpiece of Marxian theory, end quote, in some book by Adorno, 2003 Q. I have no idea what that actually stands for. What book is being referenced there? End footnote. After all, this theory is concerned not only with the intersection of production and consumption, that is, with economy, but also with the, quote, social dynamic which keeps the whole together. Producing social conflicts and conditions. The theory of surplus value should be understood economically as well as socially as a point of indifference of economy and society, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Here in the social pursuit of profit, Adorno sees on the one hand a synthesizing element and on the other a, quote, tragic element, end quote, in a society organized around the profit motive. Quote, in order for society to survive, society must expand. Insofar as it does this, it drives towards its own downfall. Here we have the innermost principle of the Marxian theory of the connection between economy and society and capitalism. Sombart and Max Weber also repeatedly emphasize this, the dynamism of capitalist society in contrast to the stasis of feudalism, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. However, according to Adorno, social antagonisms do not just exist between and within classes, rather they perpetuate themselves not only in class divisions, but also within every single individual. Quote, precisely because the antagonisms are necessary, and indeed in this way indicate the irrationality of the system, they make a final rational mastery of the social whole impossible. The discomfort in the individual consciousness, the universality of neuroses as a consequence of internalized antagonisms, is predetermined by society. The irrational danger of the system exploding is constantly raised by these conscious dispositions, which retrospectively lead to the formation in individuals of a universal fear. Marx had not yet gone so far in his theory. His concept of the class individual prevented him from relating the antagonisms of the system as a whole to the consciousness of all individuals. End quote. Adorno. The proletarian is just as much a character mask as is the capitalist. The production of surplus value is the result and purpose of the exchange of wages for labor power is, quote, the production of surplus value as the result and purpose of the exchange of wages for labor power is, quote, where Hegel's philosophy of history coincides with classical economic theory and also with Marx, the fact that people pursue their own individual interest makes them at the same time the exponents and executors of that same historical objectivity that is ready to turn against their interest at any moment and thus may assert itself over their heads. There is a contradiction here, since it is claimed that what asserts itself despite people's own efforts does so by virtue of them, by virtue of their own interests. But since the society in which we live is antagonistic, and since the course of the world to which we are harnessed is antagonistic too, what we might term this logical contradiction should not be thought of as merely a contradiction, merely the product of an inadequate formulation. It is a contradiction that arises from the situation. End quote. Adorno. Critical theory has been criticized for allegedly containing, quote, an enduring tension between respective diagnoses of totality and antagonism, end quote. A tension which is said to be, quote, clearly unsatisfactory, end quote, insofar as, quote, Adorno's focus on totality occasionally causes Adorno to lose sight of the class character of capitalist society, end quote. Lindner. Yet following Adorno, it could be objected that social totality survives only by means of contradictions. In his work, as in that of Marx, the fundamental antagonism is that of class. The diagnosis of social totality implies social contradictions and vice versa. Society stays alive not despite its antagonism, but by means of it, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, I shall say here only that the essence of this model of an antagonistic society is that it is not a society with contradictions or despite its contradictions, but by virtue of its contradictions. In other words, a society based on profit necessarily contains this division in society because of the objective existence of the profit motive. This profit motive, which divides society and potentially tears society apart, is also the factor by means of which society reproduces its own existence, end quote. Adorno. Given that individuals can only reproduce themselves through the capital relation, they also inevitably reproduce this, quote, imposed form of society, end quote, by which, quote, each of us is devoured from head to toe, end quote. Adorno. All are compelled by the threat of personal ruin to fulfill their function in the capital process, and as long as society is constituted by this opposition in the first place, so too will the objective class opposition persist. Quote, down to the present day, life has succeeded in perpetuating itself only because of this division in society, because a number of people in control confronts others who have been separated from the means of production, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Adorno continues as follows, quote, and given this reality, the needs of human beings, the satisfaction of human beings is never more than a sideshow, and in great measure no more than ideology. If it is said that everything exists only for human beings, it sounds hollow because in reality production is for profit, and people are planned in as consumers from the outset. In short, it sounds hollow because of this built-in conflict, end quote. End quote, Adorno, end footnote. According to this understanding, classes cannot be scaled according to measurable quantities, such as income. Rather, they designate the qualitative opposition between the purchasers and sellers of labor power, or between the owners of the means of production and the producers of surplus value. Adorno insists that this, quote, dynamic class theory and its knife-edge economic expression, end quote, not be, quote, diluted by substituting the simpler antitheses of rich and poor, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the antagonisms continue. The antagonisms are not directly visible, often not even directly visible as contrasts of lifestyle or contrast between terrible poverty and abundant wealth, but they continue in the shape of an antagonism of social power and social powerlessness that has reached an extreme level, and ... This contrast of power and powerlessness prevails today precisely because of the increasing integration of society as a whole, end quote. Adorno. Furthermore, quote, factory hands, end quote, individuals who possess little more than their labor power, which they are often compelled to sell in precarious, quote, employment relationships, end quote, are still needed, and indeed still exist. In the, quote, modern, or even, quote, postmodern vagabond, end quote, employee, it is not difficult to recognize the terminologically flexible proletarian flexibilized proletarian of former times, if one takes into account, quote, how close anarchy is to conformism, how ambivalent both are, how little the integration of the integral society succeeded, end quote. Adorno and Yerish, 2003. I don't know what book that's referring to, but there's a Yerish in there. The social relations which seek to make the work appear as autonomous and independent need him, economically speaking, to be an individual with a yet-to-be-realized potential for producing surplus value. That is, if they still need him to be anything other than a mere consumer, a role which of course cannot be fulfilled for long by someone without money due to lack of wage labor. In order to avoid depriving the concept of class of its socio-critical content, neither should, quote, the proletariat, in the sense of a blanket identification of subjective and objective situation, be fetishized, nor should the category of, quote, class simply be abandoned and replaced by that of the, quote, underprivileged, end quote. End quote. Adorno. When, in, quote, a sociological discussion in which someone makes use of the word, quote, class, someone objects, quote, in no time at all, that you can no longer use the word, quote, class, that, quote, nowadays you have to talk about different states. When in a, quote, sociological discussion in which someone makes use of the word, quote, class, end quote, Adorno, someone objects, quote, in no time at all, that you can no longer use the word class. The word, quote, class, end quote, Jesus Christ, Adorno. That, quote, nowadays you have to talk about different strata, and these strata have to be defined very precisely and so forth, end quote. It, quote, becomes clear that what used to be an attempt to make more careful distinctions has ended up as the wish to sabotage the critical function of concepts by claiming that their negative aspect simply does not exist, end quote. Adorno. New section. Section 3. Surplus value continues to be appropriated. Like Marx, Adorno champions a concept of class which disregards all subjective elements and is, quote, objectively deduced, end quote, from the, quote, relations of its members to the means of production, end quote. Adorno. That being said, Adorno views class consciousness as, quote, a secondary product, end quote, which, quote, is not produced automatically by the historical process, contrary to Marx's prognosis, and to the situation in the middle of the last century. Class consciousness is tending to diminish. This diminution is caused by phenomena which are described as integrative by the predominant academic sociology, and their existence cannot be denied simply because they conflict with sacrosanct beliefs. End quote. Adorno. Adorno acknowledges that, quote, plausible explanations for the absence of class consciousness are scarcely lacking. We have, for example, the fact that the workers were not becoming pauperized but were increasingly being integrated into bourgeois society and its views, a development that was not to be foreseen during and immediately after the Industrial Revolution, when the industrial proletariat was recruited from the ranks of the paupers and still found themselves halfway outside society. It is not the case that social existence directly creates class consciousness, ... End quote. Adorno. At the same time, Adorno also claims that, quote, the so-called phenomena of integration are essentially subjective, namely phenomena of consciousness among the workers, and ... their objective significance should therefore not be overestimated, end quote. Adorno. On this point, Adorno highlights, quote, how thin this crust of an integrated society actually is, end quote, going, quote, almost as far as to say that this integration is, quote, merely a form of clothing worn by society, and that if one takes off those clothes, in the very place where one would expect nature to begin, the class system now becomes drastically evident, end quote. Adorno. This indeed means nothing less than that, quote, this integration is not true, end quote, but instead owes to a, quote, semblance of freedom that is created only by a certain visible satisfaction of needs, without any change to one's real status in the production process, end quote. Adorno. The objective concept of class is valid for the simple reason that, quote, surplus value continues to be appropriated when it appears as if surplus value no longer plays the role of dividing classes because of how much bifurcation has increased in society as a whole today, pensions and social services. One should make sure that the multitude of bifurcations doesn't underhandedly become a veil which surplus value disappears behind, end quote. Adorno. Here Adorno adheres to his thesis that from the Reflections on Class Theory article, according to which those who dominate society give workers a, quote, handout, end quote, so that they can continue to work while being dominated. Quote, a portion of surplus value is returned to the workers in order to prevent crises. This occurs within the framework and for the maintenance of the existing system, end quote. Adorno. Adorno believes that technological advance, quote, makes labor objectively superfluous to a large extent. That is, the superfluity is more one of laborers than of labor, end quote. Nevertheless, the economy of society, quote, remains a matter of appropriating surplus value even with a minimum of workers, end quote. Through a, quote, kind of mercy, end quote, the, quote, handout, end quote, composed of redistributed surplus value, quote, we are all increasingly dependent on surplus value, tending to become benefit recipients, end quote. Adorno. Even though the objective concept of class must be separated from class consciousness, Adorno sees in the latter's disappearance a problem which does not leave class theory in general unaffected. Quote, if there really is a gradual process whereby those who are objectively defined, according to some threshold value, as proletarians are no longer conscious of themselves as such, and even whereby they emphatically reject such a consciousness, then, as a tendency, no proletarian will finally be left knowing he is a proletarian. In that case, despite the objective situation, the use of the traditional concept of class can easily become a dogma or a fetish. There comes a point, and I believe that this is a case in which the empirical aspect of sociology comes into its own, where a concept such as class consciousness may be simply confronted with the reality of individual consciousness. Of course, classes are not defined by class consciousness, but if the proletarians who allegedly have everything to gain and nothing to lose but their chains no longer even know that they are proletarians, the practical appeal to them takes on an ideological element. Sociological knowledge must unquestionably take account of this, end quote. Adorno. The political function of the proletariat has indeed changed, more anachronistic today than the formerly quote, famous term, quote, class consciousness, end quote, end quote. Adorno. Is talk of the proletariat itself, which now prefers to be referred to as the, quote, workforce, end quote, in collective negotiations in similar contexts. The proletarians, who, quote, hardly feel themselves to be more than that, end quote, no longer want to call themselves by that name and simply do not allow themselves to be named anymore. The designation, quote, proletarian, end quote, like the word, quote, prole, end quote, especially, is an insult associated with lack of education, antisociality, and worst of all, poverty. Footnote, quote, here it does not help matters at all that the label bracket, proletarian in bracket, is not all supposed to designate the moral qualities of someone, but rather a materially inferior status, which the system of wage labor forces upon its, quote, dependent employees, end quote. precisely because everyone hears a critique of the social status of the great mass of society. This critique of this is rejected as a violation of mores in the name of those who are consigned to this status, end quote. Decker and Hecker, 2002. End footnote. The proletariat has dissolved itself out into a mass of individual employees. Quote, the provisional result of the history of capital in its advanced zones presents itself as a classless class society, in which the old workers' milieu has been dissolved into a generalized wage dependency. Everywhere proletarianized individuals, nowhere the proletariat, end quote. Friends of the Classless Society. All who are individualized in this way accommodate themselves to their allegedly or in some instances genuinely secure circumstances, defined by, quote, nationwide lawnmowers, game shows, and statutory sick pay, end quote. Brun, Dahlmann, and Nachtmann. I have some I don't have anything by Dahlmann, but I have some pieces by Joachim Brun and Clemens Nachtmann on this channel. End footnote. The relative prosperity of the Western industrial societies is, quote, lifted large sections of the proletariat into the middle class. Taking this into account, the German sociologist Helmut Schelsky proposed abandoning the concept of class in the 1950s, advocating instead a discourse on the, quote, leveled middle class society, end quote. Parenthesis, Nivellierten Mittelstandgesellschaft. End parenthesis. Footnote. The relevant essays can now be found in Schelsky, 1979. Heinz Buddha writes that Schelsky's efforts were primarily restorative in nature because, quote, with concepts such as, quote, community of fate, end quote, and, quote, leveled middle-class society, end quote, Schelsky lent expression to the existential feeling of a collective people, bracket, Volkskollektivs, in bracket, affected by war, captivity, fleeing, and expulsion. In the Federal Republic of Germany, all the rhetoric of the welfare state appertains to coping with the consequences of war, whereby an integrative social sense beyond its political articulation was always present, end quote. Buddha. End footnote. On the contrary, numerous Marxist authors have invariably fallen back on the proletariat as the guarantors of their own revolutionary hopes, only to become embittered when real proletarians have not lived up to expectations. Some have expressed their disappointment over the fact that, rather than fulfill its, quote, class-specific mission, end quote, the working class has preferred to make itself a home within the status quo. That indeed, quote, an entire, quote, society, end quote, has made a career, from the destitute factory worker to the internet competent job seeker, from the collective lacking rights to the consummate bourgeois and company employee, from the starveling to the courted consumer. 200 years after its first world historical appearance, the proletariat is simply beyond all recognition, end quote. Decker and Hecker. However, Adorno rejects this view. To Adorno, it appears, quote, quite unjustified to blame the workers for thinking the way people think if they have more to lose than their chains. For that is not a betrayal. Rather, such accusations against workers in particular usually amount to agreement with those whose only response to the concerns of the labor movement is to reach for the truncheon. If the workers do indeed have more to lose than their chains, then that must be painful. Then that may be painful for the theory, but it is initially very good for the workers, end quote. Adorno. After all, quote, obviously, every improvement within the work process, everything that constitutes itself in the everyday struggle of the trade unions, ... is something good and positive and must be supported without reservation, and naturally this also includes the work climate. Anyone who wanted to prevent this for the sake of maintaining a purity of class relationships, as it were, will be both a fool and a reactionary. A reactionary simply because every form of independent understanding and autonomy is tied to a certain freedom from the most pressing daily needs, which can be achieved precisely by means of these improvements, end quote. Adorno. When a critical theory disregards that in many respects, circumstances faced by human beings today are better than they were in Marx's time, it ultimately fails to, quote, incorporate those aspects where the way things have so far gone materially has not actually resulted in the extreme situation predicted by Marx, end quote. Adorno. As a consequence, this theory, quote, itself becomes a fetish, end quote, insofar as it, quote, neglects the state in which human beings find themselves, end quote. Adorno. In light of, quote, findings such as that subjectively no proletarian class consciousness is present, parenthesis, class for itself, end parenthesis, end quote, Adorno views it as distinctly possible that, quote, the theory of the objectivity of class approaches the mythological. Therefore, he finds it difficult, in spite of his adherence to a critical theory of class, to continue to operate with the concept of the proletariat, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, Adorno illustrated how much critical theory has been affected thusly. At the moment when no worker feels it necessary, it's a typo. It says necessity. I think it's supposed to say necessary. When no worker feels it necessary to transform society anymore, and when it cannot be made plausible to him that existing society must be transformed, then the status of the proletariat, as assigned to the proletariat by Marx, certainly becomes extraordinarily problematic as well. Already 20 years ago, 1948, Adorno posed the following question in Minima Moralia, quote, where is the proletariat, end quote. Not only critical theory will become a real force when it seizes the masses, as Marx and Engels say, false consciousness will become a force too if it spreads among the masses, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. However, in spite of all leveling tendencies, Adorno nevertheless argues that the total integration of the proletariat has yet to succeed. Quote, let me tell you from my experience in empirical social research that there have been times which the so-called integration process was considerably overestimated on the subjective side too. That is, several studies, including ones for which I was responsible, have shown that there are more substantial differences between the consciousness of the workers in a narrower sense and that of the bourgeoisie in the usual sense, which must include white-collar proletarians, the employees, than the theory of the so-called leveled middle-class society would lead one to expect, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, here Adorno is referring primarily to the study by the Institute for Social Research on Business Climate. End footnote. After all, the, quote, more bourgeois the workers feel in their own subjective consciousness, the more they will view one another as competitors, just as other groups in society do, end quote. Adorno. Adorno regards the, quote, concept of the white-collar proletarian, end quote, parenthesis, Stehkragen Proletarier. Proletarier? I don't know. Stehkragen Proletarier. As a, quote, key anthropological category, end quote, insofar as he sees it as showing that the individual is defined by its class affiliation. Quote, the bourgeois is a human being who cannot change classes. His class is his individuality. It is the true guarantor of his estate. Here lies the actual key for the whole of fascism, end quote. Adorno. Along these lines, in one of Adorno's seminars, quote, the potential difference between objective social tendencies and the subjective self-understanding of the classes in which changes take place was discussed using the example of salaried employees. Bracket, Angestellten, end bracket. The claim that workers are passing into a, quote, new middle class, end quote, reference to the economic dependence on a labor contract as opposed to the economic freedom of the bourgeois, was rejected, as was the claim that the impoverished bourgeois state will not become proletarians, although their situation is not objectively different from that of the workers. As a substitute for class solidarity, National Socialists then skillfully deploy race and nation for their own ends, end quote. Adorno. On the eve of the Third Reich's rise, Siegfried Kracauer attempted to answer the question of the position of salaried employees in his work, The Salaried Masses. Already in the 19th century, quote, the term, quote, new middle class, end quote, bracket, neuer Mittelstand, end bracket, was coined for the, quote, middle strata, end quote, bracket, Zwischen Schicht. No, it's wrong. Zwischenschicht of salaried employees. Because the breakdown of an old bourgeoisie dispossessed by war, inflation, and surges in rationalization allowed this middle strata to grow into a mass in the 1920s. And because the salaried employees, ultimately composed the core of modern mass cultural audience, they were naturally thought of as the, quote, middle, unquote, of Weimar society. However, Kracauer exposes this notion as illusory, end quote. Adorno. Do you need help? No. Okay. Footnote. And that quote was from, that quote was not from Adorno. That quote was from a Mullerbach. Footnote. In a letter from shortly after the appearance of The Salaried Masses, Kracauer writes the following to Adorno, quote, very interesting. All these people are getting annoyed with me for getting rid of the bracket salaried employees, end bracket. End quote. Class consciousness and ranking it with the proletariat. Oh shit. Fuck. God, I'm a mess. In a letter from shortly after the appearance of The Salaried Masses, Kracauer writes the following to Adorno, quote, very interesting. All these people are getting annoyed with me for getting rid of the bracket salaried employees and bracket class consciousness and ranking it with the proletariat. This is a sensitive point. The democratic unions of white-collar workers are of course the most furious with me. They are a particularly crummy band of petty bourgeois types, end quote. Kracauer. Letter from Kracauer to Adorno, 20th of April, 1930. End footnote. In the article, Shelter for the Homeless, a chapter in The Salaried Masses, not an article, in the chapter, Shelter for the Homeless, a chapter in The Salaried Masses, whose title Adorno later appropriated as the heading of an aphorism in Minima Moralia, Kracauer compares salaried employees with the proletariat. Footnote. The corresponding aphorism by Adorno ends with the famous saying, quote, wrong life cannot be lived rightly, end quote. End footnote. Footnote. Translator's note. The German title, Asyl für Obdachlose, is translated as, quote, refuge for the homeless, end quote, in the standard print translation of Minima Moralia. Asyl can also be translated as asylum, refuge, or shelter. End footnote. Krakauer compares, quote, the average worker upon whom so many lowly salaried employees like to look down often enjoys not merely a material but also an existential superiority over them, end quote. After all, while the life of the, quote, class-conscious proletarian, end quote, is at least still, quote, roofed over the vulgar Marxist concepts, end quote, the, quote, mass of salaried employees, end quote, is, quote, spiritually homeless, end quote, in comparison. And those quotes are from Krakauer. Quote, economically proletarianized, fervently bourgeois in their ideology, end quote, salaried employees, quote, contributed a sizable contingent to the mass basis of fascism, end quote. Adorno argues. Although definitely a product of and objectively belonging to the proletariat, these employees were led to believe that, quote, they were something special, end quote, and thereby made to, quote, toe the bourgeois line, end quote. Meanwhile, regarding the established, quote, culture of employees, end quote, of his own time, Adorno describes it as having, quote, become the universal ideology of a society which mistakes itself for a unified middle class, end quote, thanks to a, quote, lasting market boom, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. According to Adorno and Hans Eisler, every culture is, quote, supposedly high-class entertainment, accessible to recipients of small paychecks, yet presented in such a way that nothing seems too good or too expensive for them. It is a pseudo-democratic luxury, which is neither luxurious nor democratic, for the people who walk on heavily carpeted stairways into the marble palaces and glamorous castles of moviedom are incessantly frustrated with being aware of it, end quote. Adorno and Eisler. End footnote. Alex Demirovich expresses skepticism concerning Adorno's interpretation of the Marxian theory of value. For Demirovich, Alex Demirovich expresses skepticism concerning Adorno's interpretation of the Marxian theory of value. For Demirovich, the former and the latter are, quote, only compatible to a limited extent because Marx takes the view that no deception occurs in the capitalist form of the exchange of equivalents. On average, the full value of labor power is remunerated, and with that, equality is already realized, end quote. Demirovich. Yet this is precisely also the view of Adorno, who recognizes that the realization of equality in exchange reproduces the inequality of individuals. Quote, in the concept of exchange, the principle of equivalence is co-posited. Yet the analysis of political economy shows that the principle of equivalence is violated at its very origin by being upheld. The concept of the exchange society should be seen as an eminently critical concept. The exchange of labor power is already no longer an equivalent exchange. In a non-exploitative society, exchange could be realized as equivalent. End quote. Adorno. Demirovich objects to Adorno that Marx, quote, makes clear in his analysis how the problem of a standard for equality is solved by the market-mediated formation of an average of socially necessary labor, end quote. Demirovich. However, Adorno establishes along with Marx that this standard negates itself precisely through its application and exchange. Quote, this is the decisive turn in Marx's work, that unlike some primitive socialist or primitive anarchist who opposes bourgeois society, Marx doesn't simply claim this is all true. Rather, he claims, in order to be able to transform this tremendous apparatus in the first place, we want to use its own power to set it in motion. In a passage on subjective logic, Hegel had already described how it is the task of dialectics to absorb the power of one's opponent into one's own argumentation and use it against him. The Hegelian principle is paid extraordinary heed by Marx and taken extraordinarily seriously. Instead of simply rejecting bourgeois society's claim to achieve harmony, he takes it completely seriously and asks, is the society which you theorize really identical with your concept? Does your world of free and just exchange really correspond as you claim to a free and just society? He also stays faithful to the principle of dialectics when he says that it does and it doesn't. He shows that in this society everything fits with equivalence genuinely being exchanged, yet that there is one decisive area, namely, that concerns the commodity of labor power, where, because everything fits, something doesn't fit, end quote. Adorno. In other words, quote, the assertion of the equivalence of what is exchanged, the basis of all exchange, is repudiated by its consequences. As the principle of exchange, by virtue of its immanent dynamics, extends to the living labors of human beings, it changes compulsively into objective inequality, namely that of social classes. Forcibly stated, the contradiction is that exchange takes place justly and unjustly. It's a good passage. End quote, Adorno. According to Adorno, it is just as evident that equivalents are exchanged as it is that, quote, the exchange rate is itself a calculation, the mathematical form of the equation of exchanged goods in a socially prevailing exchange, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, in the, quote, calculatory equation, end quote, which, quote, relates the same with the same, end quote. Adorno discovers in the ideological, yet at the same time also real equality, an emancipatory element, quote, which has found the difference between bourgeois society and feudalism, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. For Adorno, there is no doubt as to the mathematical operationalizability of exchange. For, quote, to exchange commodities is to cancel one act by another. It is thus an essentially timeless activity, although it takes place in time, not unlike a mathematical operation, which is also in its essential nature out of time, end quote. Adorno. With precisely this mathematical exactness, Adorno argues, Marx could call liberalism to account insofar as, quote, Marx's system is also a critique of political economy, that is, also a critique of the liberal field of national economy, end quote. Adorno. Quote, Marx already formulated the economic laws mathematically, but in contrast to the devoutly mathematical positivism, he used them sardonically, end quote. Adorno. That is, not like, quote, national economy, which focuses in mathematized fashion on states within established market society, end quote. Adorno. But rather in a way, quote, that attacked the undoubtedly mathematizable fiction of pure exchange, and in a sense calculated the failure of liberalism based on liberalism's own concepts, end quote. Adorno. The mathematization of economic laws, Adorno claims, follows, quote, deductively from the exchange of equivalents. It is not statistics, end quote. Adorno. Quote, Marx did explain in the preface to Capital that he only coquetted with Hegelian language. However, if dialectics are taken seriously in practice, then it must be possible to develop the whole of Marx's theory from any point therein. That is, in its own movement. The dialectical thought must pass into the concrete, end quote. Adorno. That being said, Adorno does not advocate the exact mathematical quantification of the findings of Marxian theory. For Adorno, this would be the goal of a, quote, positive, end quote, economic theory focused on, quote, exact market laws, the mathematical calculability of supply and demand, end quote, a goal he rejects precisely because, quote, the market is already a construct, end quote. Because positive economic theory, quote, dispenses with all foundational problems, end quote, Adorno argues it is insufficient, quote, the ultimate concern cannot be to express system-immanent processes and formulas. Rather, the deeper problem is to determine the significance of an economic phenomenon in society, end quote. Adorno. There will, quote, necessarily be a distance between mental models and empirical data if theory is to be more than a reproduction of facts with the help of concepts. Marx did not want to create an operational theory, but rather a theory of society as a whole, and the whole of society can never be fully empirically grasped in the way it is possible to do with individual sectors, end quote. Adorno. New section, section 4. The service of abstraction. Quote, exchange takes place, end quote, Adorno claims, quote, through money as the equivalent form, end quote. At the same time, the, quote, true unit which stands behind money as the equivalent form is the average necessary amount of social labor time, which is modified, of course, in keeping with the specific social relationships governing the exchange, end quote. Adorno. Adorno thus concludes that, quote, two commodities become commensurable with each other precisely on the basis of the average social labor time invested in those commodities, that is, without regard to their specific determinants, end quote. Adorno. Quote, what makes commodities exchangeable, quote, what makes commodities exchangeable is the unity of socially necessary labor time, end quote. Adorno. There's a footnote that I missed. See also notes made by Adorno following a discussion with Sohn Rettel. Quote, the abstractness of exchange and its categories by no means spontaneously becomes conscious, but rather can become so only by means of money, as that which synthesizes an infinity of exchanges represents the totality of the immediacy of the connection of individuals to each other, and to nature, end quote. Adorno to Sohn Rettel, or Rettel. Sohn Rettel. End footnote. Insofar as exchange takes place according to equivalence, it is assumed that objects of exchange have a common measure. Because objects are qualities, quote, the objects to be exchanged must be commensurable with each other. Their specific and naturally occurring qualities having been forgotten, sanded away by abstraction while nothing remains beyond the abstract unit of labor time applied to them, according to which they are exchangeable. End quote. Adorno. Yet this means nothing other than that the exchange process is itself, quote, a process of abstraction, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the exchange of materially different things is the exchange society, in the exchange society demands the service of abstraction, end quote. Adorno. Adorno emphasizes the, quote, implicit element of reflection in the exchange process, end quote. Adorno, which possesses, quote, bracket, an element, end bracket, of conceptuality, end quote. as, quote, the category of exchange, ... is itself also something conceptual, mental, end quote. Adorno. Quote, whether human beings know it or not, by entering into a relationship of exchange and reducing different use values to labor value, they actualize a real conceptual operation socially, end quote. Quote, even if a single human being had not had the idea of this absolute exchange, there would objectively still be a process of abstraction in the objective reduction to the same. A process of abstraction which amounts to the objectivity of the conceptual (bracket element) end bracket. End quote. Adorno. Where the hell am I? However, this process of abstraction, quote, distances this process of abstraction self from the objects. And this process of abstraction is false in itself, because qualities do not simply disappear in the course of exchange, but are also retained, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the exchange of equivalents of exchange values equal to each other requires, as Marx very extensively showed, that one can disregard the particular use value quality founded upon the sensuous immediacy of the individual things or objects to be exchanged. Exchange value, exchange in general, only exists insofar as there is a concept to this extent. The concept, the element of the concept. Fuck. I accidentally pressed the wrong button. Let me restart that. Quote, the exchange of equivalents of exchange values equal to each other requires, as Marx very extensively showed, that one can disregard the particular use value quality founded upon the sensuous immediacy of the individual things or objects to be exchanged. Exchange value, exchange in general, only exists insofar as there is a concept. To this extent, the element of the concept, that is, the immaterial element, lies not only in the construction of concepts, and not merely in the observer, but just as much in the fact of social objectivity itself, which Marx attempts to analyze, end quote. Adorno. Mediated through this conceptuality, so too is the, quote, concept of society, ... a mental fact, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Hence, according to Adorno, Marx also, quote, cannot be called a nominalist when he asserts the primacy of the totality before the realities collected with it, end quote. Adorno. It is much rather the case that, quote, the Marxian approach contains a kind of autonomy of the concept, which would be entirely foreign to a primitive materialist nominalism, end quote. End footnote. End quote, Adorno, end footnote. Adorno defines the ability to abstract not as an anthropological invariant, but rather as something acquired, as something which has developed over the course of human history. Human beings, he claims, had to endure, quote, a very painstaking and lengthy journey, end quote, in order to, quote, first learn to abstract, that is, to emancipate themselves from external nature. Abstraction is only possible at a certain state of history. Quote, as a rule, the most general abstractions arise only in the midst of the richest possible concrete development, where one thing appears as common to many, to all, end quote. Marx, end quote, Adorno. So a Marx quote within the Adorno quote. In arguing that pre-Socratic writings already bear witness to this process, Adorno again recapitulates the motif of a historical continuity from prehistory to the present. In Fragen der Dialektik, Questions of Dialectics, Adorno claims that rationalism has an element of untruth, precisely insofar as, quote, in order to produce consciousness from identity between the matter and the idea, it trimmed the idea, cut away at it, just as already occurs in one of the myths from the circle of Heracles, and in the final instance in the model of the exchange economy, ... All rational thought really does have something of this exchange process. Not for nothing can formulations of an exchange of like for like, according to the arrangement of time, already be found in the earliest pre-Socratic drafts of a rational explanation of the world, in the work of Anaximander as well as of Heraclitus, who followed the former. End quote. Adorno. Here Adorno returns to a consideration from a few years earlier regarding the, quote, proto-bourgeois, end quote, saying by Anaximander. In the English translation by Kathleen Freeman, which is itself based on a German translation by Hermann Diels, the standard during Adorno's time, this quotation reads as follows, quote, the non-limited is the original material of existing things. Further, the source from which existing things derive their existence is also that to which they return at their destruction, according to necessity, for they give justice and make reparation to one another for their injustice according to the arrangement of time, end quote. Quoted from Freeman. Kathleen Freeman, and that's Anaximander. For Adorno, quote, Anaximander's curse, end quote, Adorno, points to aspects of, quote, archaic legal vindictiveness, end quote, which were mythologically legitimized. Quote, the law that defined itself as punishment for lawlessness comes to resemble it, and itself becomes lawlessness, a order for destruction. That, however, is the nature of myth as it is echoed in pre-Socratic thought, end quote, Adorno. At the same time, this saying describes the dynamic which blindly reproduces, quote, the same pattern over and over again, end quote, perpetuating it into the present. Quote, as long as men were not completely in control, either of themselves or of society, the social process would continue in irrational cycles, in spite of all rationalizations. For Marx and before Marx, Hegel, the dialectical movement of history could, in a sense, be summed up as a permanent transition or unchanging change. With a kind of hope born of despair, Marx applied the term, quote, prehistory, end quote, to no less than the entire stretch of history known to him, to what had been and was the realm of bondage, end quote. Adorno. Hence, quote, the dialectical process had to be described in terms of perennial categories, which needed only to be modified to apply, for instance, to the modern rational form of society. This is why in Marx, such expressions as, quote, wage slavery, end quote, which he applied to free wage labor are something more than metaphors, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. In writings which are more polemical than scientific, Marx at times refers to, quote, capital and wage slavery, end quote, Marx, end footnote. Rather, end quote, end footnote. Rather, they are the expression of the historical constant of relations of dominance and exploitation, from slavery to wage labor. Footnote. Quote, what distinguishes the various economic formations of society? The distinction between, for example, a society based on slave labor and a society based on wage labor is the form in which this surplus labor is in each case extorted from the immediate producer, the worker, end quote. Marx, end footnote. In his lecture course, Philosophical Elements of a Theory of Society from the summer semester of 1964, Adorno accounts for, quote, exchange as a social rather than an economic phenomenon, end quote. Adorno. That is, as a phenomenon within existing society. In doing so, Adorno works out a view he describes as, quote, completely heretical from the perspective of Marx's theory, as Marx believed that power, ... could be derived from the exchange relationship, end quote. Adorno. To clarify this view, Adorno refers to the saying, quote, leonine contract, end quote, which is based on Aesop's fable, the lion, the cow, the she-goat and the sheep. Also titled The Lion's Share in some translations. Numerous variations on this fable exist. This title corresponds to Laura Gibbs' translation. End footnote. Quote, "An alliance made with the high and mighty can never be trusted. This little fable proves my point." An alliance made with the high and mighty can never be trusted. This little fable proves my point. A cow and a she-goat and a long-suffering sheep decided to become the lion's companions. They went into the forest together, and there they caught an extremely large stag, which they divided into 4 portions. Then the lion said, "I claim the first portion by right of my title, since I am called the king. The second portion you will give me as your partner. Then, because I am strongest, the third portion is mine, and woe betide anyone who dares to touch the fourth." In this way, the wicked lion carried off all the spoils for himself. End quote. Aesop. From this point of reference, Adorno goes on to describe exchange in capitalist society as follows. Quote, "The exchange of labor power for wages that is required of every worker may be a free contractual relationship in formal terms with complete parity between the two sides. But in reality, of course, the worker will face hunger and have nothing to live on if they do not enter into the contract, and are thus forced by objective circumstances to sign the contract far more than is the entrepreneur who, viewed as an overall class at least, can generally wait until the worker sees reason, as the saying goes, namely subjective reason, and accepts these terms. If for a second you do not take what I am conveying to you as individually as I have presented it, but rather extrapolate to the conditions of society as a whole, what this means is quite simply that the decisive exchange act, namely the act of exchanging live labor for wages, in fact presupposes the class system, and it is decisively modified and modeled by this class system in such a way that the semblance of freedom for all parties which is created by the legal contract of the wage agreement is in reality nothing but that, a semblance." I'm going to copy that down, so pardon me for the pause. Where the hell am I? Initially, this view is anything but a heresy against Marxism, for at various points Marx also emphasizes that classes must have already had to exist before the capital relation could develop. Among other places, this claim can be found in Capital. Quote, "The capital relation presupposes a complete separation between the workers and the ownership of the conditions for the realization of their labor. As soon as capitalist production stands on capitalist production's own feet, it not only maintains this separation, but reproduces this separation on a constantly extending scale. The process, therefore, which creates the capital relation can be nothing other than the process which divorces the worker from the ownership of the conditions of his own labor. It is a process which operates two transformations, whereby the social means of subsistence and production are turned into capital, and the immediate producers are turned into wage laborers. So-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as, quote, primitive, end quote, because it forms the prehistory of capital, and of the mode of production corresponding to capital, end quote. Marx. Yet in his subsequent lecture course from the winter semester of 1964 to 65, titled History and Freedom, Adorno does formulate an independent theory of class. When Adorno speaks of the hindrance of genuine progress by the principle of exchange, this theory goes beyond that of Marx. Quote, bourgeois society creates the concept of progress, and the convergence of the concept with the negation of progress originates in the principle governing society, namely the principle of exchange. Exchange is the rational form of mythical eternal sameness. In the tit-for-tat of every exchange, each act revokes the other. It is a zero-sum game. If the exchange was fair, then nothing has happened. Everything stays as it was. People are quits. Things are just as they were before. At the same time, the assertion of progress, which conflicts with this principle, is true to the extent that the doctrine of tit-for-tat is a lie. It always was a lie, and not just since the so-called capitalist appropriation of surplus value, in the course of which the commodity of labor power is exchanged for the cost of its reproduction. For one of the parties to the transaction, the more powerful party always received more than the other. Thanks to this injustice, one that had been codified as early as Aesop's fable about the lion, something novel takes place in the course of the exchange. The process that proclaims its own stasis becomes dynamic. We might say, then, that progress originates in the fact that the justice that amounts to a repetition of sameness is unmasked as injustice and perpetual inequality. The truth of the expansion feeds on the lie of the inequality. Social actions are not supposed to cancel each other out in the overall system, and yet they do not. Where bourgeois society satisfies the concept it cherishes of itself, it knows no progress. Where it knows progress, it sins against its own law in which this offense is already present. And with this inequality, it perpetuates the wrong that progress is supposed to transcend. ... Zarathustra proclaims that man will be freed from revenge, or rather, he does not proclaim it, he preaches that man shall be freed from revenge. For revenge is the mythical prototype of exchange. As long as domination persists through exchange, the myth will continue to prevail too. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. This passage is almost identical to a passage from Adorno's article titled Progress. Thus Spoke Zarathustra contains the following, quote, for that mankind be redeemed from revenge. For that mankind be redeemed from revenge. That to me is the bridge to the highest hope and a rainbow after long thunderstorms. End quote. Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Nietzsche. End footnote. This passage once again reveals the meta-economic principle of domination via equivalence and identity, which has become total under capital, is central to Adorno's work. Furthermore, it also demonstrates that class analysis, which Adorno allegedly, quote, hints at only aphoristically, and relegates to the periphery of his thought, end quote. Kreimeier, 1983, is in truth at the center of both Adorno's critique of economy and Adorno's critical theory as a whole. And that is the end of Chapter 12 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein, translated by Adam Baltner. Thank you so much for listening.